Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time of day it is. I do hope it finds you well. My name is John, and I'm an author, and welcome to my writing space. I'm coming to you here for another StoryTime Thursday, where I'm going to be reading Chapter 4 of my second book, And the Sun Burned Red. It's available on Amazon, as well as my first book, The Shadow of the Past. The links are down below. It would mean a lot to me if you were to uh, buy them, check them out. They're available both in soft cover as well as paperback. That's the word I'm looking for, as well as Kindle. Um, as well as, aside from that, it would also mean a lot for me if you were to like, share, subscribe, leave your thoughts down below, follow my socials, follow my website. All of that is in the description here and would really mean a lot to me. But without further ado, here I'm going to go ahead and get started. We have And the Sunburned Red, Chapter 4, A Test of Skill. For Amjoh, the following week passed much the same as his first 3 days in Ras Tonun. He would rise at dawn, go to the kitchen and take his breakfast, wander around the dancing garden or some other part of the city for the bulk of the day, return to the kitchen for supper, and then would repair to some rooftop and watch the moons and stars until he tired enough to go to sleep. He had several more conversations with Nelva about gardening, and in the evening Syrrin gave him a bit of his time in which Amjoh would question him about magic. Neither was particularly forthcoming with new information, however. Although Amjoh was not sure whether this was because they were being deliberately evasive, or they simply assumed that he would not understand anything more complicated. The other Eisen continued to pretend as if Amjoh did not exist, and as far as he could tell, they all seemed to live in their own little worlds, wandering around, eating, studying, or doing whatever else they pleased. Occasionally, he saw one or two of them in conversation with each other, and once he passed by what looked like a private residence with its front door open and thought he heard a shouted argument. Only Nelva, who seemed to care little about what others thought, and Syrrin, who seemed to have been officially designated to mind him, he ever paid any attention to him at all, at least directly. Many was the time that Amjoh walked past an Eisen and thought he could feel their eyes boring into him as he walked away, but he never caught any of them at it. The only part of the whole situation that Amjoh found truly frustrating was that no one would tell him about the proceedings of the council and what was going to be done about him. Even Syrrin refused to talk about it, saying that it would not be appropriate for him to discuss the inner workings of the council with an outsider. It was only after heavy prodding from Amjoh that Syrrin finally revealed that, while a brief emergency meeting had been called after he arrived, the next council meeting was not scheduled until the new moon, still 2 days hence, and that they saw no need to alter their set schedule. So, for yet another day, Amjoh rose and stretched, although his shoulder was almost completely back to normal, had his breakfast, which consisted of a small loaf of bread and some fire-roasted vegetables, and set off to explore. He was getting better at navigating the city, and although he still did not fully understand exactly how and why the city was designed as it was, he could now reliably find his way around, at least in the northern part of the city. He decided, however, that this day was going to start. He was going to start to explore in greater detail the southern part of the city. He already had some idea of how to get to the entrance of Ras Tonun, but there was so much else to see, and he clearly had time in which to see it. During the morning, he took to simply wandering down different pathways, now taking the left path, now taking the right path, then the center, and so on at his own whim, and discovered several things which intrigued him. The first was a tiny garden which was filled with flowers that were almost glowing white, which turned to follow him as he moved past. The second was a wall upon which was painted a colorful and beautiful mural containing a number of strange figures. There were several Eisen and human in the picture, but other figures as well. Some figures looked very much like humans, but some were thinner with strangely textured skin and ears like leaves, and others were shorter and stockier with luxuriant beards. There were other figures as well, some beautiful and others hideous, but all of them vaguely humanoid. Above and beneath the figure was a beautiful flowing script which Amjoh guessed was the Eisen language. But though he wondered what it said, he did not attempt to read it, since he could hardly read his own language. It was shortly after seeing this mural that Amjoh climbed a steep flight of stairs and found himself in front of a building that was unusually decorated with various banners and stripes of a dark green. It was Amjoh's guess that the building was a perfect square, although from the ground and only seeing it from two sides, he could not really be sure of that. There seemed to be a fair number of Eisen around the entrance to the building, so Amjoh decided he would move in closer and find out what the Eisen were doing. As Amjoh had expected, none of the Eisen milling around the main entrance of the building, talking with each other, paid him any mind as he approached, and quietly slipped into a smaller door to the building that was a little way to the right of the main entrance. Upon stepping through the doorway, Amjoh found himself standing inside a long circular hallway, lit with green crystals. The statues that adorned the hallway were that of Eisen carrying various forms of weaponry and striking various valiant and warlike poses. This surprised Amjoh, as until that moment he had thought the Eisen the most singularly unwarlike people he'd ever met or heard of. The whole effect of the hallway, with its lighting so very different than either the red sun Amjoh was used to or the yellow or white crystals that the Eisen seemed to favor for light, combined with the aggressive statuary, created a particularly eerie atmosphere. After taking a moment to get his bearings and adjusting his eyes to the peculiar green light, Amjoh noticed that all the Eisen seemed to be heading to his left, towards a set of doors that would take them further into the building. Amjoh decided, although he could not be entirely sure why, to head to the right and see what he could find inside this building. As he did so, the other thought occurred to him that this was likely the Hall of Trials that Syrrin had told him about, and warned him not to enter unaccompanied. This thought almost made him stop and leave the building, but in the end he convinced himself that he was already inside, and that he thought there was nothing wrong with having a bit of a look around. And after all, the Eisen had seen him at the entrance and paid him no mind. It stood to reason that if he were really not supposed to be there, that they would have asked him to go somewhere else. Resolved and confident in that line of thinking, Amjoh proceeded to wander down the corridor of the strangely lit building, looking for whatever path would lead him deeper inside. At last, after he had wandered for several minutes, he came upon a large pair of doors to his left, which, like everything else in the buildings and the city in general, stood wide open. Amjoh found himself in another corridor which ran straight for about 100 feet before turning sharply to the left. As Amjoh walked, he passed several rooms filled with various equipment. Inside some were weapons of every type that Amjoh knew, and far more that he neither recognized nor could fathom what they were for. Other rooms were completely empty or had a few practice dummies tacked to the wall, against the wall. One room even had an Eisen training with a weapon that looked like a spear, but with a three-pronged head attached to both ends. He stopped for a moment to admire the grace and agility such a weapon required, but quickly moved on when it occurred to him that the Eisen probably did not wish to be disturbed in what he was doing. At last, Amjoh came to the end of the corridor, which, through another set of open doors, spilled out into a large stone surface, perfectly square, that was slightly raised from the ground level. On each side of the square was a rising set of stone seats, which were filled with several dozen Eisen, who were all watching the square intently. From his close vantage point, standing about the same distance from the square as the nearest seats, but also 10 feet lower on the ground level, Amjoh got an excellent view of what happened next. Upon the stone square stood two Eisen facing each other with weapons in hand. One combatant was wearing robes of deep green and the other of light purple. The green-clad combatant was slightly taller and seemed to carry himself straighter than his purple-clad opponent. The green-clad Eisen had also a hair of bright flame red that was only just barely going gray, and skin that was almost charcoal in color. He was wielding left-handed a sword that appeared to be made of wood, some 2 feet in length, which grew wider further away from the hilt, and ended in a crescent with 2 points facing outward. The purple-clad Eisen seemed more hunched up with hair and beard that had gone almost completely gray, and he was wielding what looked like wooden axes in each hand. Just as Amjoh arrived, the two combatants seemed to be paying respect to each other by placing their weapons against their foreheads and bowing slightly. After the signal of honor had occurred, the two combatants took up ready positions, and after a long moment in which it seemed as though all watching held their breaths, the two Eisen lunged at each other and began the most interesting battle Amjoh ever saw in his life. It almost did not seem like they were fighting, more like they were involved in some elaborate and choreographed dance. Rarely did weapon meet weapon, and instead it was an entire series of feints and dodges. The previous 10 days being around the Eisen, nothing that Amjoh saw made him think that they were capable of such agility or precision. But that was not what impressed him the most. It boggled his mind just how much mental awareness it would take to be able to react to and avoid their opponent's moves so quickly and so effectively. Amjoh could not be sure just how long this dance of battle went on, but in the end it was the green-clad Eisen who triumphed. With an easy elegance, he sidestepped a powerful downward blow, spun and brought the flat side of his wooden sword against his opponent's stomach hard. The purple-clad Eisen seemed to be bent in half by the blow and then fell to the ground, almost as if he were in slow motion. Amjoh had to resist the urge to clap, but he managed to strangle the cheer in his throat when he realized that while most were nodding in approval, none of the Eisen was applauding the victory. Instead, they all rose solemnly and stood staring at the winner. They did not have long to wait for him to speak. The green-clad Eisen gave the sign of respect to his opponent, who was still groaning on the ground in pain, then carefully laid his wooden weapons down and stood up straight again to address the crowd. "I, Elinan, do claim victory in this trial of skill," began the green-clad Eisen, turning slowly so he was addressing the entire crowd. "By the terms agreed upon by us, my esteemed opponent shall cease all..." As Elinan turned and faced Amjoh's direction, he stopped suddenly and stared at Amjoh, and Amjoh stared back in guilt and surprise. Elinan's face slowly changed from confusion to surprise and finally to anger, and he said simply and clearly, "What?" Realizing that he was in serious trouble, Amjoh turned and tried to run the way he had come, but he was barely half a dozen steps when he felt the sensation of ropes wrapping around his torso and limbs. He looked down and saw tendrils of blue energy coiling around him, which he was powerless to fight against as he was lifted slightly in the air and pulled backward into the stone square. When he had been placed down firmly a few feet from Elinan, the tendrils loosened enough for Amjoh to move around, but did not disappear. Turning to face Elinan, who was now once more a picture of calm serenity that all Eisen seemed to be, he noticed that the blue energy which bound him originated from the green-clad Eisen's outstretched palm. "So you must be the human who managed to stumble his way into our city," said Elinan, his speaking voice deep and melodious as Syrrin's was. "What gives you the right to simply walk into one of our most sacred buildings and disturb an ancient ritual?" "The door was open," responded Amjoh, trying to remain calm. "I was curious as to what you were doing. I did not mean to offend." "Of course the door was open, foolish child," berated Elinan. "The door is always open as a welcome for Eisen to come and train and witness the trials, not for some wandering human with a habit of coming lost. I am sincerely sorry." "You are sorry, are you?" vented Elinan, by this time talking to the crowd as much as to Amjoh. "Can apologies so easily erase a profanity? You humans are always acting without thinking. If you had wished to learn of the Eisen, then we have books beyond counting in our library. That is assuming you could even read. Amjoh shook his head slightly. Sadly, I cannot well read even my own language, so to learn I must observe and follow. Elinan scoffed at this. So you cannot read and go snooping for things that you cannot possibly hope to understand. We are scholars beyond compare. You should be on your knees begging to be granted any scrap of our knowledge, not sneaking around where you do not belong. I would gladly cease to bother you if I would just be permitted to leave your city. I swear that I would never return or tell anyone of what I have learned here, pleaded Amjoh. You think you could pierce the shroud of our city and we will just let you leave? Countered Elinan. Those of us on the council have a lot to decide upon regarding your fate, and given that you profane this ritual with your presence, I am tempted to make a decision for the council right now. That is enough, Syrrin. Elinan, Syrrin said, walking calmly through the crowd that had gathered around the stone square, cutting Elinan off mid-sentence. Elinan turned to face Syrrin and said sarcastically, Well, if it isn't our wise leader come to tell me off for mistreating his new little experiment. Syrrin, who had reached the stone square by this point, arched an eyebrow and said calmly, You often claim that you have an excellent mind. I would kindly ask that you use it. And what is that supposed to mean? You have just given a little speech against acting without thinking, observed Syrrin, and yet you would execute this young human without a full discussion of the council and hearing all points of view in detail. That seems rather contradictory, Elinan. Elinan rolled his eyes. Oh, very well, Syrrin, have it your way. We shall have a nice little debate before we eradicate him on one condition. Which is, Amjoh blurted out, hoping that it was not going to be anything too unpleasant. Elinan grinned wide. You must face me in a trial of skill. Syrrin sighed at this. Is that really necessary, Elinan? Elinan gave a firm nod and responded, Yes, Syrrin, it is. He profaned this ritual and he must atone for that. And what terms do you propose? Elinan thought about this for a moment. If I win, then he may not travel anywhere in this city unaccompanied by one of us. And if he wins, then he may go wherever he will, save our deepest sanctum unaccompanied. Syrrin turned to Amjoh and asked, Does that sound acceptable to you? Amjoh did not like the sound of this trial of skill, but did not think he really had much of a choice, so he agreed to the terms. Elinan's smile was almost malicious by this point. Very well then, Syrrin, take the human to select a weapon and explain to him our rules. With that, Syrrin took Amjoh by the shoulder and led him firmly from the stone square into one of the dog-legging tunnels which fed into the arena. They came at last to a large room with a wide assortment of wooden weapons in it, and at the entrance, Syrrin beckoned that Amjoh should find himself a weapon that suited his skills. After several minutes of rummaging, Syrrin finally addressed Amjoh. I feel I should apologize. I warned you against coming here, for I was worried something like this would happen, but did not tell you either what the Hall of Trials looks like, or specifically why you should avoid it. Is it wrong that I am fighting? It is certainly not ideal, admitted Syrrin slowly. On the other hand, you made the right decision to accept Elinan's challenge. If you had refused, you would have looked like a coward, which might have hurt your chances against the council. Accepting, even if you lose, shows courage, which might be of some help. Is there any chance that he will kill me? Syrrin shook his head. Elinan is many things, but he really does care about the rules and rituals of the trial of skill. And killing one's opponent is strictly forbidden, although serious injury may occur. What is the purpose of the trial of skill anyway? Asked Amjoh, testing out a long, blunted wooden spear. It is a way of us resolving disputes between us safely. What do you mean, safely? Syrrin replied, I would have thought that was obvious, but then again I suppose you have no familiarity with magic. The use of magic can often have a good deal of collateral damage, and a duel between two mages, especially mages as powerful as we are, could be destructive on a massive scale. Therefore, long ago our ancestors developed the tradition of the trial of skill to resolve serious disputes in a manner that would not lead to widespread chaos and destruction. That makes sense, nodded Amjo. Does this happen often? Once it was only done on rare occasions, admitted Syrrin. However, in recent millennia it has become almost a sport which people such as Ellen enjoy participating in. By this time, Amjo had found a thin spear which was both to his liking and seemed to be the only weapon which he had any training in, and was beginning to make his way back to Syrrin. Tell me honestly, Syrrin, Amjo said, do I have any chance of winning? Well, he began, you have the advantage of size, in that he is a bigger target than you are used to, and you are a smaller one than he is used to. You are a little bit faster, I think, and are pound for pound stronger. On the other hand, he has the advantage of agility and perception, not to mention millennia more experience. With that, Syrah and Amjo made their way back to the arena, during which time Syrren briefly went over the rules. Both combatants stand on opposite sides of the square, and you bow to each other in the traditional manner, which I assume you already saw. After that, the rules are simple: no killing or permanently crippling blows, and the fight proceeds until one combatant is on the ground and unable to rise. As Amjo walked up on the square and lined up opposite Elinan, he was still looking extremely pleased with himself. Who was still looking extremely pleased with himself. He noticed that the stone seats were now filled with at least 100 Eisen who had turned out to watch such a peculiar trial of skill. He placed the spear against his forehead, bowed to his opponent, who was doing the same with his sword, and took up a guard position. Elinan took up his own ready position, and, building for the lunge like a cat ready to pounce, the Eisen's face turned to one of glee as he lunged for his opponent. Amjo just barely dodged Elinan's first blow and dove out of the way of the second. So surprised was Elinan that his attack missed that he did not turn quickly enough to block the blow, which came in from Amjo and cracked him hard against his right elbow. The next several exchanges of moves moved much the same way. Elinan would lunge in fast, and Amjo was able to evade the attack and get an attack of his own, which seemed to have little effect on Elinan. Amjo figured that Syrrin was correct, and it was merely a case of Elinan not being used to striking such a small target. This is not to say that Amjo was not grazed twice trying to dodge Elinan's attack, which would have floored him if he had connected properly both times. It was too good to last long, however. On his eighth attack on Amjo, Elinan brought up his blade in a sweeping blow, which forced Amjo's blocking spear into his legs, tripping him up. Elinan followed this up almost instantaneously with a sweeping blow the other direction, which caught Amjo on his right side. Amjo experienced a white-hot pain down his side and the feeling that several of his ribs cracked. The blow also sent Amjo sprawling to the ground, and although some part of him knew that the trial was over as soon as one combatant was unable to rise, he endeavored to get off the ground quickly. However, Amjo had barely gotten to his knees when Elinan brought his wooden sword down against Amjo's back, knocking him to the floor in a daze. Elinan stood over Amjo, smiled, and then turned to address the crowd. I, Elinan, do claim victory in this trial of skills. By my rights as victor, Amjo has agreed that his wandering days are over without a guide. Good luck of the council meeting in a few days, sneered Elinan as he swept past the recovering figure of Amjo and out of the hall of trial, followed by several other Eisen. Syrrin carefully helped Amjo to his feet, and as he did so, Amjo noticed that a great many of those Eisen who had watched the trial had stayed and were looking at him, obviously at least a little impressed. Amjo was in agonizing pain. He felt as though all the ribs on his right side were broken, some of them to the point where it was very painful to breathe. Yet he managed to croak out, that go well?" Syrrin nodded. "That was very well done, human. I know it seemed like a brief battle, but your attempt to rise looked well upon you. I just wish that it didn't hurt so much." Syrrin nodded at this. "You certainly have a point there. Now let us get you back to your room and get you healed. You have a big couple of days coming up." And that is the end of my chapter. As I mentioned, it would really mean a lot to me if you were to take a moment to leave some comments and feedback down below. Please also like, share, subscribe. Check out my socials. Check out my website. Check out my books. Any and all help and support would be amazing and really help me out. In the moment, however, I do hope you all have a wonderful day, get a chance to do or experience something creative, and I'll catch you on the next one.